Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Beth Cobert, the Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget. And on behalf of OMB and the Council on Financial Assistance Reform, COFAR, I want to say how much we appreciate the incredible amount of collaboration and partnership from all of you that has gone into the development and implementation of the uniform guidance that OMB published last December. I want to take a brief moment just before we begin our discussion to share with you how the implementation of the uniform guidance fits with the administration's overall vision for the second term. Throughout his time in office, President Obama has been committed to making government more efficient, more effective, and more transparent for the American people. This is demonstrated through multiple actions, including the executive order and presidential memo that kicked off the uniform guidance effort, as well as many other areas, including our Open Data Initiative, strategic sourcing, shared services, and federal spending transparency. Having now worked for the past 6 years as an administration to develop sound management policies, we are now focusing on implementation and institutionalization of the best of those so that the efficiencies in government we have identified can be realized for years to come. The uniform guidance is a perfect example of this. Having had a robust dialogue with stakeholders for the past 3 years over what the policies should be, and having issued guidance that reflects that dialogue, we are now turning to implementation of these policies. Of course, the guidance itself is a high-level policy document. We know that as diverse organizations turn to implementing its guidance, there will be many questions, including questions that stakeholders have for each other. That is why we are hosting the discussion here today, to kick off the conversations that will continue between many different types of organizations, as well as with OMB and the COFAR. And we're delighted to bring this to you using technology so you can see and hear us and really feel more part of this exchange. We look forward to extending this dialogue as we go forward. Extending this dialogue is one of my highest priorities personally. We know the policies now, but we need to work together as we implement them, and this needs to be a collaborative effort. We know we face big changes. They affect the bottom line and operations for many organizations, diverse organizations around the country. We know it will take time for everyone to learn about the new policies and fully implement them. We expect that this conversation will require a degree of tolerance and collaboration from all of us in this process. Personally, I know from my time when I served as the board chair of the United Way of the Bay Area in San Francisco, California, a large nonprofit, that the process of applying for and executing federal grants would have been so much easier for us if the uniform guidance like this had been in place. Having a single place, a one-stop shop, to find all of the federal guidance would have been extremely helpful to me in my oversight role and to our staff. It would have simplified compliance and, most importantly, would have allowed us to focus our time on delivering against our mission of helping those in our community. This personal experience makes me even more delighted to see how this reform is moving forward into the implementation phase. We all look forward to working with all of our partners here today and with those who are joining us electronically to make sure we are maximizing its potential. With that, I'd like to introduce David Mader, who was recently appointed and confirmed as our new controller at OMB. Dave has had a distinguished career in both the government and private sector. He formerly served as an IRS Assistant Deputy Commissioner, where he received the Distinguished and Meritorious Presidential Rank Award and the Treasury Secretary's Honor Award for his work. Before joining OMB, Dave was a Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton, leading the firm's work with the Department of Treasury and many other federal agencies. He is also a fellow with the National Academy of Public Administration. Since joining OMB, Dave has been an inspirational advocate for strong financial management and partnership across government and beyond. And I'm sure that all of you will enjoy working with him as much as I have. Without any further ado, please let me welcome Controller David Mader.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Beth mentioned, I joined OMB on the 2nd of June, so actually today is my 4-month anniversary. So I guess I'm probably pushing the envelope by saying I'm still new. I think I've sort of worn out that I'm new. But one of the things that actually has been fascinating to me in coming to OMB and to this position is really learning about the entire grants program. As Beth mentioned, I spent many years at the IRS, and we had a very small program. And I think in the last 4 months, I've really come to understand and appreciate not only the complexity of this, but the importance of the grants program and the importance that each and every one of you that are participating in this event today play in the delivery of services to citizens, to research, to basically how we as a country perform. For those of us who are new and really getting to understand the COFAR and the COFAR's work, I'd like to share a little bit about the background of COFAR and the uniform guidance in particular. The COFAR was created in October of 2011, so relatively new, and was charged with recommending the policies to OMB that would transform the delivery of financial assistance. It includes the 8 largest grant-making agencies in the federal government and 1 small agency that rotates on a 2-year cycle. The first agency that rotated on and off now was the National Science Foundation, and now we're pleased that the State Department has assumed that responsibility, and especially thank you for them hosting this event today. As Beth mentioned, developing the uniform guidance was a 3-year effort, and as part of my homework, I did actually look at and read, and I'm sure you have all read this document. And I think it's important to step back and sort of reflect on what's been accomplished in 3 years, because I know, having issued lots and signed lots of regulations at the IRS in my days there, that this is no easy feat. It takes a lot of hard work, not only on the part of the government, but I think more importantly, on the part of the stakeholders and the individuals who actually are going to implement this new guidance. This new guidance, as we all know, was issued last year, the day after Christmas. I wonder about the timing, but the day after Christmas of 2013. And over the course of these last several months, I think we've done, as Beth mentioned, I think a very good job, and I actually think it's a model on how to engage stakeholders in an ongoing dialogue. I think that this kind of collaboration serves as a model for a little work that I'm doing right now on this little thing called the Data Act that has the same kind of far-reaching impact, not only on the entire federal government, but on numerous stakeholders across the country. Since publishing the guidance last December, the conversation has continued into the details of implementation. And with 2 more webcasts, 2 more rounds of frequently asked questions, and all of this data is available for you on the COFAR website. Going forward, OMB, together with all of the grant-making agencies, will issue a joint interim final rule no later than December 26th. And as actually our staff were talking the other day, it would be nice to get it out before Christmas as opposed to the day after Christmas, but no guarantees. We expect to issue any technical corrections as needed, where it may come to our attention that how we propose something prevents the guidance from delivering what we really intend as the way of simplification. We know from listening to all of you that this guidance has the potential to truly transform grants management, and I think Beth shared with her personal experience and her reflection on, gee, if I had this years ago, we could have done an even better job in the effort that she led. We also think that, and as controller, I can't sort of help but think about the potential savings. And we believe that these new policies will save probably in excess of $50 million a year. And that's a benefit certainly to you as well as to us. But I think importantly, besides just the dollar savings, it's the reduction in the burden. You know, the cost, the opportunity cost on how we go about each and every day exercising the delivery of services through the grant-making program. For university, it means more dollars to put towards basic research that underpins innovation, not only in the United States, but around the world. For smaller nonprofits, the simplification will remove the barriers to entry and open up competition for federal awards to more and more entrants. For state, local, and tribal government, it means more flexibility to develop efficient, evidence-based programs that best provide citizens with the services that they most need. And finally, this policy will improve the oversight of awards by increasing transparency through the publication of audit reports, requiring recipients to have strong internal controls, and requiring federal agencies to review the risk prior to making an award. As I mentioned, a lot of hard work has gone into this effort to date. But I also think we recognize that there's a lot of hard work now to come. Sometimes it's easier to make the policy than it is to implement the policy. And as Beth mentioned, this is transformational. And we've been working hard over the last 9 months learning about the new policy. We've answered questions in webinars. We've issued frequently asked questions. But I think that this is just the beginning of that journey. We plan to continue the conversation. And as I mentioned, I do think that this is a model for the rest of government, where we have the active, ongoing dialogue. It's not a one-time event. It's a continuing dialogue among all of the required stakeholders. To that end, earlier this week, OMB announced the publication of metrics that we're going to use to measure the impact of the new reform. We want to know what's working and what's not working. And for us to be effective in using these metrics, we need your participation, we need your input in, again, the continuing dialogue over the next several years. Each of the panelists that we will hear from today have been an integral and active participant in shaping the debate about the policies, where we're going, and how we're going to actually implement this grant reform. What I'd like to do right now is to introduce our distinguished panel members. Steve Daniels is the Director of the Division of Policy Review and Resolution at the Department of Labor. Dr. Brett Baker is the Assistant Inspector General for the National Science Foundation. Tasha Repp is a partner at Moss Adams and is the Government Accounting Standards Advisory Council appointee representing the Native American Financial Officers Association. Helena Sims is the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the Association of Government Accountants. Mandy Nelson is a partner at KPMG and is the former chair of the AICPA. Kim Moreland is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and Sponsored Programs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is on the Board of Directors of the Council for Government Relations and the Federal Demonstration Partnership. Matt Hamadou is the Assistant Secretary of Illinois Department of Human Services, and David Thompson is Vice President of Public Policy at the National Council of Nonprofits. I'd also like to say a special thanks to the staff at OMB for driving this effort. We have, I think today, 3 of the folks that really have been the individuals responsible from OMB for driving us to the issuance of the guidance, the constant interaction with all stakeholders, and now the kickoff of the implementation. 2 of them will be appearing on camera today, Gil Tran and Victoria Collins, but I would also like to acknowledge the leadership that Karen Lee has played in this effort over the last several years. So with that, I would like to thank everybody, the panelists, for traveling in to participate, and like to turn it over to Gil and Victoria. Thank you.
everyone. Thank you to Beth and to Dave for those opening remarks. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Our goal for the discussion this afternoon is really to go kind of beyond the guidance. And as Beth and Dave have both raised, we're really at the point where we're working on implementation now. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. And as folks are kind of getting to know the policy, a lot of questions are coming up. And these questions really go beyond what does the guidance say and get much more into how does everyone understand the guidance together? How are we going to work together to actually implement this? And these questions go beyond just questions to OMB, but questions that stakeholders have for each other. So what we really wanted to do today is invite all these folks that have been here today to have this conversation together. And just to go ahead and get right into it, I think the first topic that we've received a number of questions on is the focus that you find throughout the guidance on internal controls. This was a huge priority for OMB, and I think one of the, and the COFAR, and one of the main themes that you see throughout, and what really allowed for a lot of the administrative flexibility that you see in the guidance, is a view that kind of lifts up from very prescriptive procedural policy requirements and instead provides guidance that recipients and non-federal entities are required to maintain strong internal controls within their own organizations. So I know we have gotten a lot of questions from folks about what exactly that means on the ground, and I'd like to turn it over to Kim Moreland to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Victoria asked me to say a little bit about where I'm from, which is the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's a beautiful campus nestled among the lakes in Madison. We are often known for things like brats, craft beer, and, yes, the best cheese on the planet. However, today we're going to focus on other aspects, including the continuing quest for academic excellence and the importance of scientific research in the future of Wisconsin and, yes, the country. So I would say that we were uniquely poised, perhaps, to think about internal controls at Madison because we have begun a 2-year initiative to examine all of our processes relating to internal controls. And then I found the December 26th release of the Uniform Guidance mentions internal controls repeatedly. I've never talked about internal controls in my life until this year. So I wanted to ask our friends in the audit community, how will you go about approaching the need for strong internal controls, both sort of as a background for our regulatory environment, but also as it applies to specific topics that are mentioned?
Well, Kim, I'll kick it off. I'm Mandy Nelson, and I'm with KPMG. I'm in our national office, and I oversee the technical side of audits relating to any type of public sector entity. And of course, one of the big things would be the single audit. But as we were talking, internal control and the need for it at recipients is not new. And it's not new that we, the auditors, are going to have to test internal control. We've had that responsibility in the single audit since the single audit started. So that's not new. But I think what you're talking about is the sudden kind of awareness that Section 303, the must, a sentence that has both must and internal control in it, certainly got people's attention. And yes, the should sentence, the ever popular should sentence, you know, that the internal control should involve COSO and the Green Book. And I know, Brett, Green Book's you've been involved in working on the Green Book, so you have a lot of ties to it. Right. But let's clarify, what does should mean? Should doesn't mean must. Must means must. Yep.
Or is that true?
What?
What does should mean?
Should means that those documents are best practices. So if you think about if you were going to go build something, like you're going to go build your internal control, you'd look for handbooks and things that help you. So you look to COSO, you look to the Green Book, and you say, what information can I get out of those documents? A lot of people put a lot of time about actually, as you said, one of your professors spends his life talking about internal control. That's the people that wrote those documents. So why not look there and say, okay, they're good documents.
Could I ask Brett
And I
to comment?
think just to add in on that, and again, I'm Brett Baker. I'm the Assistant IG for Audit, National Science Foundation. We've got a tremendous interest in NSF in making sure that the grant programs are working the way that they can. Science, technology, engineering, math are a big deal. So getting into the should language and the must language, when we see terminology like the should outside of the uniform guidance, typically we'll see things referenced as presumptively mandatory. So you'll see that there's a certain procedure out there that it's anticipated that it was going to be actually executed, and if there is a reason to not do so, it has to be well documented. So, and then that's counter to what a best practice is. So it's a little bit more challenging, I think, from a standpoint of an institution or recipient of federal funds, how to deal with that. I do a lot of speaking in the research community, and then I just spoke over the last couple of weeks at 2 different conferences, and that topic actually came up in each one of those sessions, or each one of those conferences I spoke at, and they're really looking for more insights, because it's going to take a lot of funding. For example, I know that we talked offline that you're building some new systems at Wisconsin, that if you're going to put some systems in place based on a best practice, it's going to be costly. Do you need to? Do you have to? And I think that's something that they're really grasping for out there, or grappling with out there in the should statement. So, I mean, they're more used to, in terms of other guidance, AICPA standards, the Green Book, there's the Yellow Book that we use for audit work. Should has a much more, I think, a stronger reference or inference.
So could I turn to Victoria, do you mind, and ask maybe the most important question on the university side right now is the one regarding the FAQs and the preamble, because those documents clarified a great deal that we were confused about in the guidance, including the should versus must conversation. But will those carry the same weight as the uniform guidance does?
Yes, those do carry the weight of providing additional context to the OMB guidance that came out. Of course, the guidance itself is into CFR 200. That's codified in the Code of Regulations. But, for example, when we put out the compliance supplement next year, the compliance supplement will reference both the preamble and the frequently asked questions, and that will be what gives auditors, for example, and non-federal entities that are recipients kind of the reference that they need to rely on those documents in interpreting the guidance going forward. I will say that we do anticipate that these additional documents are really provided as a roadmap as we kind of change from the state of the world where we had these old circulars and we all understood them and we sort of knew where the pitfalls were and what the big issues are, to now we have this new guidance, and in some cases we think we understand it, but we're not sure if the guy sitting across the table understands it the same way we do. And so that's why, A, we want to have conversations like the one we're having today, and we want to continue this conversation. But B, we have these additional documents that can kind of help us navigate that transition. And some of those questions about the effective dates and such, once it's effective, those questions will fall away and they won't be needed as much anymore. So it's not as permanent of a reference, but it does have weight. And one question that we've gotten a lot along those lines is if there's anything that we've seen into CFR 200 since it's come out where the COFAR has realized, hey, we might have had an error there, it might have actually not communicated what we thought we communicated. We're taking that list of issues now, and the COFAR will take a very close look at that. And if there are any technical corrections that need to be made into CFR 200 to the guidance itself, the COFAR anticipates making those changes at the same time that the draft reg implementing the guidance is published. So by the time it goes into effect, there should be one completely consistent set of guidance, and those additional reference documents will be available to rely on as well.
So if I were to go back to my friends in the audit community, it's so seldom I can ask auditors questions. Instead, they come and ask me questions. So I'm loving this. So assuming then that the FAQs and the preamble fall into the compliance circular, does that take care then of our interpretations that were expressed? So for example, the explanation that conflict of interest is not about scientific integrity, it has to do with financial transactions. Is that going to be audited based on the FAQs rather than on the original document only?
Well, as Victoria said, I know when I was looking at the draft 2015, that was one of the comments, is how many places can we incorporate references to the FAQ? Because, yeah, I mean, we've got to follow no, you can't hold us to different standards than you, so we'll make sure that it has a real place.
No, and I'd have to agree. I think all the various guidances out there in the uniform guidance, we're going to be looking at that closely and just making sure that it matches up with what we see on site. So, I mean, I have to agree with Andy.
That's very helpful. Then perhaps I could look at a specific issue as an example. So at Wisconsin, we have an electronic effort reporting system that we've had quite a while. It's been through a number of audits. It was very expensive to implement, and it is even more expensive to maintain in terms of the staffing, the involvement of our faculty. We certify 10,000 people twice a year. I have 500 effort coordinators on campus. The mechanism is huge. So if I read the uniform guidance and I look at its reliance on standards of documentation and on the application of adequate internal controls in relationship to effort reporting, can you help me understand what is the balance? How do I know that the standards I establish will meet a test that occurs later in an audit?
Well, there's clearly going to be a lot of judgment.
Yes.
So, you know, if on any given topic, if the three of us talked about it, we might have slightly different views of that. But, you know, one of the things we were talking about is before you decide that, you know, throw that system out the window and do something else, involve discussions, you know, involve your auditors, involve your agencies to make, you know, to have those discussions, and please do it at the design phase.
Oh, yes.
Let's not go to operating effectiveness tests before we start having these conversations. And, you know, one of the first things I'm going to ask you is, you know, as in your role, you're going to be signing certifications. You're going to be drawing funds down. So, you know, you're the first line. So how are you going to feel comfortable that those employees worked on that grant and that those charges advanced all the way up to the books and records that were used for the draw? So if I sit down and I talk to you and you're like, you know, I sleep perfectly. I sleep better than I do with my old system. You know, we're gonna go through those. And, you know, I might not use all the COSO terminology and things, but some of the underlying concepts there. How do you monitor it? How do you communicate your controls? All of those are going to be part of that conversation. Brett?
Right. I'd like to add on to that. I agree totally. What we're trying to do with effort reporting, when we take a look at it, we want to see assurances that the funds claim for federal funding purposes, they're actually used for the award, and then the system controls that you're using to actually process those transactions, can it actually trace back to valid support, some way to be able to get like an audit trail for that purpose. And then whether or not the certifier, the person that's actually attesting to that work that's being done, that there's clear knowledge of that work and that we can tell that from an audit standpoint. And then, well, if we can tell that from an audit standpoint, managers within the institution can do that as well. So we're looking at that. We're looking for strong policies, procedures, system controls that are built in. I do like the reference of talking to your internal audit staff just to get an insight on how system controls can be set up. I think internal audit is vitally important at institutions. I talk to folks in the internal audit staff every time I go out to a conference. I'm talking to them and getting their insight. That's a main area that they focus on is effort reporting.
And if you're at a smaller entity that you don't have the internal audit, maybe you have a board member that you could sit down and have this discussion. If they're a board member from a public company,
That's right.
you know, they've lived and breathed internal controls quite a long time. So, you know, find somebody to have that conversation with. It's just, you know, planning.
I think that and those are all great statements, and we would take them to heart. But wouldn't you say actually the safest course of action would be to stay with a system that has been through a number of audits and wait as these policies and their interpretations are refined over the next couple of years?
Well, the whole idea was...
I hate to be conservative, but
well,
it's tempting.
It is tempting, but there's really nothing, there's nothing in the guidance that actually says all of those are blanket, you know, if you had this before, it's still fine. I mean, the question is still going to be asked, how do you sleep at night? You know, even if you don't change your system, that is going to be the question.
And that's a key point. Like, internal controls are really designed to help you do that, sleep at night, making sure that you have really good assurances, you're comfortable that you're using federal funds properly and you're charging it. In many awards in federal government, 60, sometimes even 70% of the funding's in effort reporting. So it's a big component of the charges to the federal government. So from our standpoint in the federal government, we want to make sure that the controls are in place. So we look at that so closely when we go out, and I know that in single audit, that's one of the main areas that you look at. Single audit is visibility, switch gears a little bit, is a visibility to the federal government, how institutions are complying with the various rules, terms, and conditions of the uniform guidance. In essence, are you using funding properly, you have controls in place? That's the underlying principle, overarching principle as well. Internal controls are so critically vital.
Right, because when you're saying, I might not have to do anything, well, but you are implementing the uniform guidance, and that says internal control. So if you put in your system, I think, you said it was expensive, you said it did a little while ago, but now you're under this guidance, so you still have to take a fresh look at it and say, what are those controls? I bet when you put it in, the people that were in your IT department, the people who were the PIs on those, aren't necessarily the same people that went through the training, and I'm sure you spend a lot of time doing the training on that new system. But, over time, people change, your underlying computer system could have changed, so, how do you feel comfortable with the IT component? And, you're talking about something that we call management review control, where a PI looks at those timesheets or something. Do you, if I sat down with that PI and I said, what exactly would you consider to be an error? What are you looking for? To your point, how do you know that's what the person did? Those are the kind of, questions to just rethink.
And it is very tempting to get lost in a discussion of effort reporting, but I'm going to spare you that since we're really talking about internal control. So let me look at another example that is very simple, and that is perhaps one of the best things in the uniform guidance as it's being received by the faculty at Wisconsin is the idea that now computing devices under $5,000 are allowable as a direct cost. I mean, that's where they stand up and applaud when I talk about this. But for them to be allowable, they have to be essential and allocable. So to me, this is a perfect conundrum for internal controls. What does it mean to be essential and allocable? Does it mean that my faculty member bought it, so it must be necessary to do the work of this project? Or does it mean that my faculty member fills out a 2-page form justifying how that iPad relates to the research going on? Or can I hopefully find someplace in between? How do I make that determination?
Well, I think, you actually touched on it when you started your discussion on that it's really key to, does it make sense to, for those charges to be applied to the federal awards that you have? Those funds are critically important to ensure that for NSF awards, science, technology, engineering, math is being advanced. I think it's clear from an audit standpoint, we want to be able to see that those charges in that device is actually something that makes sense to that award. So we're looking at it from that standpoint. Documentation helps us do that. We also just interacting with the various, the PIs and the various individuals working with that equipment, we can gain that understanding, that assurance.
Yeah, Brett used the word audit trail. How would a week from now, a year from now, somebody actually going to be able to answer that question?
Yes. But still answer that question and not devote so much time to it that it becomes another burden, which we're trying to obviate, obviously.
So in that regard, that's reasonable assurance, right? And that's essentially what internal controls provide you is reasonable assurance that, in this case, the equipment that is being charged to the federal government is being used for the appropriate purposes for the award. So we just want to gain that assurance. I know on single audit, you're looking at it from that standpoint.
Right. And, kind of the difference between the process of purchasing that versus the control to know that it was appropriately charged to that grant. The monitoring of it, communicating your policies. All of those are, we all think of signing off or filling out a form. But, if you've got an IT problem or, you don't continually train people, then all those forms aren't going to help. So that when we talk about internal control, it's more than the actual control activities. And that's one of the things I think if you just sat down and, I know, kind of amazing, but to read the Green Book or read COSO, you'd get that sense without having to say you had to do every one of the 17 principles,
Right.
but you'd kind of see where people are looking for controls.
Right, so the control environment, I think a lot of what we've been talking about is really, you're looking at from that standpoint. Do we have good tone at the top? Do we have policies, procedures, good structured approach? I mean, when auditors come in, we can see that pretty readily. It looks like a very solid process that we're looking at. Risk assessments, you do that regularly. I actually talked about that offline. We talked back in March, I think, a lot about that just understanding where your risks are, and then you apply controls appropriately. I think that makes sense. The control activities that Mandy mentioned, those are things that we're going to test. We test those extensively. There are more specific things that you want to be able to have in place to make sure that you're using federal funds appropriately. So we do pay attention to that, and the monitoring is so critically important.
Great, I think that's very helpful. And I'm happy to hear that we're thinking about these areas in the same way. Now, I do have the COSO cube printed and on my desk, just to remind me from time to time that, a little checklist, do I have a policy and procedure, and on down. But I know the control environment becomes particularly important, and the monitoring process. So we'll be concentrating on all of those.
I think we're going to turn it back to Victoria.
I think we could.
Yes, all right. Well, thank you, all three of you, very much. This was a really great dialogue, and I learned a lot. So thank you. And I think if we could thank Mandy and Brett for their participation, and ask Gil Tran and Tasha Rep to come join us for the next couple questions here, and we will keep Kim. Because this next question is one as well, or next sort of segment to transition to is one that I know is also of great interest to the research community. And that is the new language in the Uniform Guidance on Procurement Standards. This is an area where we've gotten a lot of questions, where the Uniform Guidance, of course, took many circulars and brought them together into one consistent uniform set of guidance, with some exceptions where there needed to be for different entities. But the procurement standards was one of those areas where we brought together language historically from A102 and A110. And the COFAR, looking at that, really thought there was a lot of value in the A102 language in terms of setting up accountability and consistency, and so applied a lot of that language more broadly. And while there aren't many significant policy changes, there are some, and there's a lot of new language that's new to the A110 folks. So I want to turn it back over to Kim and see what questions you may have about that.
Thanks again. And now, I don't have the auditors. I have Gil Tran, who knows everything, and
I'm still
Tasha Tasha is going to help me, but I forgot you're an auditor for the moment.
Okay.
So we got to the uniform guidance. We had the day after the holidays to read through it, and I get to the procurement section, and I'm shocked. So I think I wasn't alone with that. And the reason we were shocked on the university side, and if I could also on the nonprofit side, is because these look very different from Circular A110. We all have the charts that compare them. A110 was, in fact, quite brief on this topic. We found that very approachable. But it does appear that there is a great deal of emphasis on procurement methodology. There are very specific approaches laid out. And it made us feel almost as though we had somehow been a naughty child. And then we were thrust under new rules so that we would behave better. Was this intended to be addressing behavior that was inappropriate?
I think I'm going to repeat what Victoria has said. The intention is not to, this is, by the way, I'm Gilbert Tran. I'm with the Office of Financial Management. I work for Dave and Beth. Dave's still here. No, the intention there, as Victoria kind of briefed us on the background, is not, this is a problem area that needs to be addressed. The issue here is more, we have now, when we combine the two circular A110 and the common rule, we look at particularly in the procurement areas, and we see that the A102 common rule have more prescriptive requirement or description provision on procurement. And we take a look at A110, and like you say, Kim, the A110 section is actually still a section, is 215.40 to 48, but it's very vague. It's used word, for example, like to the maximum extent practicable, right, on the competition, or for written procedures when you use analysis of lease and purchase where appropriate. So it's little kind of, very good feeling type of things. And we look at, so it's not like, we have a lot, doing our single audit, we have a lot of findings that procurement is an issue. It's basically that we want to ensure accountability and increase competition for all the use of federal fund. But if you take a look back at what are behind those procurement that we have now, I do want to acknowledge to you that this is new for college, university, and nonprofit. This is not something that they've seen before. This is more prescriptive. It is more, you fit into the bucket in terms of, so now you have the 5 type of procurement. You have the micro purchases, the small micro purchase, the small purchase, and you have the sole seal bids, and you have the other seal bid. What's the other one, Victoria?
You got small purchases, micro purchases.
Competitive, and then the sole source. So you basically have the 5 things, but they are very prescriptive in terms of the type of procurement that you're going to have. But if you take a look at what the underlining of it though is, you basically have the same type of things. And actually, I do have a bear clause that I want to show you to
Now, this always makes me want to run for a bite of pastry.
Yeah, see, this is actually
this
is actually the bear clause that I kind of designed for the procurement. And if you take a look at this bear clause, this is the official bear clause. If you take a look at this middle here, that whole all type of procurement, you will see that the 5 main criteria that was in A110 also now, in the uniform guideline, and you have to have, of course, anything that you procure with federal fund have to comply with all this, the general criteria, and that is you have to have a document policy. Your procurement policy have to be documented. Your purchase have to be necessary. All right, how are you going to make sure that that's the case? Full and open competition is another criteria. No conflict of interest, then you have to have a conflict of interest policy in place, and then documentation. So if you have the general provision here, that's what I intend. And the other thing, there's only 5 types now. You didn't differentiate in A110, but now you have 5 types of procurement. The micro purchase, which are anything that less than $3,000. The small purchase, anything less than $150,000. And you have the seal bid, competitive proposal, and you have the little pinky sole source. So basically, it is different, something that state and local have to comply about in the past, and now we think that to ensure accountabilities, ensure increased competition, we want to have to uniformly to all grantees.
And I think the state, local, and tribal governments had a sigh of relief because this is very familiar to them.
Yes.
That it didn't change for them.
I will say, and Gil and Victoria know this, that there was a great deal of concern that this might be the single most expensive part in terms of dollars to implement in the uniform guidance on the university side. Now, some of our questions you have addressed in the recent set of FAQs. I'm not sure that everyone has had a chance to digest those yet, so I thought we might talk about some specific issues. I was tempted to bring, we've been meeting with our purchasing department at Wisconsin over the last 3 months to go through those purchasing requirements and look at them against our current purchasing policy to see where are their fits and where are their gaps. And we have now discussed the entire segment, and we are down to a page of 32 pages of questions. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them here, But I thought we might talk about some of the ones that were really
Sure.
a change for us. And one of those is the introduction of the term conditional title. Because that sounds as though now when we purchase a piece of equipment on a federal award, we might not actually own title. Is that the case?
That is not the case.
Oh,
So let me differentiate a little bit of your question and procurement. I think your question is more on
The property side.
The property side. And I would like to say that, on the property side, we did not change much. So what you are familiar with A110 on equipment, the property, how to, you need to buy you need to buy the necessary thing. You don't have a duplication. You need to screen, the equipment, beforehand for any duplication. Those are pretty much the same. So you should not see any big difference between the equipment and property management that you see in A110, to the uniform guidance. That's not the case in procurement. I think we already established that. That's, the procurement standards are now much different from the A110. So the conditional title, no, is basically the title still going to be vested with, when you buy an equipment with federal fund, the title still going to be vested with university or nonprofit or, tribals and state local. The condition is basically that there are conditions that if you're going to buy, you have to have proper records of it. And at the end, they still have a proper disposal requirement that you have to go through. That's the condition that we want you to just be aware of. It's nothing else tied to it.
So basically, we do own the property once
Yes.
we purchase it, as long as we adhere to the basic standards.
Yeah, and
For
those
property
and
purchases.
that's why the adjective conditional title.
Okay.
Yeah.
While we're still on property, there was language in there that baffled us initially because it talked about, in our record-keeping systems, being able to document the percentage of federal participation in the project costs
Right.
rather than in the purchase cost of the equipment. That sounded like a lot of reprogramming of our purchasing property system.
That's another clarification that I think we made in our FAQ, that there should be no change in your equipment system to maintain that property records.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, skip over now to procurement, because
Yeah.
you did mention micro purchases.
Yeah.
Another new term, and this one is perhaps the most troubling for us on the university side. Most of us, many years ago, went through and changed our equipment definition to meet the federal standard of $5,000 in a useful life of 1 year. And when we changed our equipment definition, we also made changes in our purchasing policy. So that, and I use Wisconsin only as an example, but I believe this is the most common example, that our procurement card purchases allow those purchases up to $5,000.
Right.
Now with the concept of micro purchase, which requires no competitive bidding of really any sort, at the $3,000 limit, does that mean I now need to start documenting purchases between the $3,000 and $5,000 cap?
So basically, yes, you are
This sounds like a lot of work, Gil.
You definitely are correct in terms of the micro purchase is at the level of $3,000. But I want to address the micro purchase again, because if you take a look at the micro purchase, it's $3,000 or less. You need no quotation,
Right.
And the only thing that we encourage, and this is a should situation here, not a must. The thing is, you should make sure there's equitable distribution. So if you buy $2,000 of pencil, from Office Depot 1 year, we want to encourage you to take a look at what your university offer, the next year's or the year after that, maybe staple. So we encourage you to do that. So no quotation, and encourage some equitable distribution. The reason, and we did think about that. COFAR did think about the $5,000. That's because that was a lot of comment that we received from college university. Unfortunately, we want to tie it back, the $3,000 and the $150,000 for more threshold to what is current in the FARs. So that's where it comes up.
Why don't we tie the FARs to the uniform guidance?
That will
Can
be
we talk
another.
about that?
I think actually, Gil, do you want to talk too a little bit about the small purchase threshold? Because I think to Kim's question about do you have to change your charge card threshold, it might be good to highlight some of those flexibilities that are really, that go all the way up to 150,000 as well.
Yes, I think that's the good point. Thanks, Victoria. And the small purchase, I want to remind everybody again, because a lot of universities came up to us again and say, wait a minute, 150, you know, we got to get the cost analysis, we got to get the price analysis, we have to document, we have to go after RP. No, the up to $150,000 for small purchase, the only thing you need is rate quotation. And even the uniform guidance didn't say that you need 3 or 4 or 5. We just say more than 1, so you can actually have 2. And those 2 price quotation can be from anywhere. You know, you can get a quotation from searching on the net. You just need to document that, though, that you get a price quotation from there. And there is no cost or price analysis. That is reserved for the sealed bid and competitive proposal. These 2 guys over here. There's 2 guys over here. And you know, the bigger purchase, you know, that you need, you know, cost proposal, cost or price analysis. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we have in the uniform guidance in describing small purchase, we say that this type of purchase should be relatively simple and informal. Simple and informal. So that's the whole concept about the small purchase.
And I love those words, but I do want to just reference back to our friends in the audit community again.
Right here.
Excusing,
Tasha.
no, Tasha's not going to come in and audit us, I hope. And the need for a control environment for some standards of documentation. And so I will tell you that at Wisconsin we felt sort of a double whammy on this, because it is going to require some way to manage documenting purchases between $3,000 and $5,000 that we do not currently have in place. So either that has to be the principal investigator or someone on his staff who's making the purchase, or I have to have purchasing agents who can do that. And frankly, I don't think we have the capacity to put this in the purchasing office, so we have to manage that. But the second part of it is, even though you have given us flexibility up to the simplified acquisition threshold, we are an entity of the state, and so we are subject to all of those rules at the $50,000 level. So on that end, we're probably very strong because the focus is on high dollar purchases. But now we're going to be adding what we see as a new emphasis on those lower dollar purchases, many of which will not even be in our inventory systems. Do I sound like I'm whining?
No, maybe a little.
Thank you. No.
I think that's a very good observation, and I think that, you know, when we took a look at these procurement definitions, and for those that were following kind of the common rule A102 language before, you know, there are a few people that I think can take this as an opportunity to change some of their procurement requirements under that small purchase requirement and increase the level of documentation that it requires for sealed bids or competitive proposals. Because in the auditees that we audit, like you, a lot of them are at a much lower dollar amount, and recognizing that, you know, the governing bodies generally are establishing kind of what that level is, that there is more flexibility built into that, and it may be a broader issue to be looking at, you know, should we be reevaluating kind of what the small purchase threshold is at each of our individual governments or entities.
Okay. Could I go back to something you referenced also on the procurement side? And that is, we initially had some concerns, Gil, that most of us in large universities are in fact part of consortia arrangements for purchasing so that we can maximize our buying scope in order to get better pricing. So we think of that as strategic sourcing, and we've been doing a lot of work on that on the university side. So that means that there was indeed competition for the price of pencils and toner and all of those things that are commonly purchased. But it is not associated with that immediate purchase. Is strategic sourcing going to be out the door?
No, definitely not. I think that strategic sourcing and sole sourcing procurement as well are definitely going to be allowable. And if you take a look at the section 318 in the guidance, we encourage efficient purchasing. So what you're doing there is basically more strategically, to make sure that you get the best purchase out there. So it's going to be no problem. I don't think so.
Those strategic sources will consider to have been through
Yes.
a competitive process.
Yep.
Okay.
Just to even add a little bit of emphasis on that note, the guidance actually encourages non-federal entities to have procurement policies and procedures that lead to the most efficient procurement for the federal government with those federal dollars. So it's in the federal government's best interest for non-federal entities to have purchases that are done efficiently, whether that means bulking them together or spreading them out. Shared service agreements among different campuses or entities within a consortia are encouraged, as well as those strategic sourcing agreements where the competition is there at that higher level, but then within that strategic sourcing arrangement, the purchasing can be done much more quickly.
Great. That's good news for all of us, because you know, as we all know, that there's a great deal of pressure on funding, not just from federal awards, but from all sources. So we're trying to stretch that dollar as far as possible.
And I think there's a little bit of other good news that Gil might be willing to talk to us about. When we had a conversation earlier, we were talking about how the procurement standards apply to purchases that are ultimately charged to an indirect cost pool.
Yes.
And whether the procurement standards apply to those purchases, Gil?
Okay, so basically, yes, that question come up a lot because, not only you have procurement that, get charged directly to federal, to federal fundings, and then those are kind of flow through your building and maintenance or operations or your admin. And as you can see in the FAQ that we put out right before Labor Day, our answer is no. The procurement standard that you see here do not apply to any charge that not directly charged to federal projects. So I think the example that we gave in the FAQ is a good one. It's basically if you have a contract to clean the building, right? Yeah, that you have negotiated in the past, and that contract is $1 million, for the whole years. Is going to eventually get into the computation of O&M for the operation maintenance on the indirect costs. Mm-hmm. Those do not have to follow the BAR clause at all.
That's great news.
Okay, thank you.
We appreciate that.
All right.
So could we go back to sole sourcing?
Yes.
Sole sourcing was
The last
this might be
question
the
on
last one. Okay.
And then
It
you
was
can-
already very difficult, but
Yeah.
now I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we can get it done
Okay.
with the prior approval requirement. Would you talk about it?
Okay, so the sole source is one thing we want to clarify is the sole source is at all level. So it's not just a sole source, for the small purchase. The sole source can be applied to any. We have $1 million purchase. Mm-hmm. If you fit those 4 criteria here, mm-hmm. then the sole source is available, right? So basically, if you get into the situation that your purchase is unique, only one provider, can provide you this type of thing for your research, then, it's okay. And if it's a public emergency, there's an emergency to do that. You need to buy something to finish up, or your test on, for example, Ebola. That's in the heart of things now. Then you just go ahead and do it. The third thing is if authorized by agency. If your agency, they say, hey, we need this next week, not next month, and your agency allowed it, then it's fine as well. And the one more thing, though, the pass-through entity can declare that your purchase can be sole source as well. So for the sub-award, they can look up to the state, for example, who gave them the award, say, okay, can we buy this from this source because we need it? Then they can give authorization. And the fourth thing is no competition. Is in rural somewhere, and this is the only vendors that can provide you this type of service or product, then that sole source is allowed as well.
Great. Thank you.
You want to talk about the grace period?
Oh, yes, I think that's one last thing worth mentioning.
That would be great.
We're going to end on a good note.
Let's do that.
Okay. So,
Go ahead.
okay, so basically, one of the things that we want to point out that in our FAQ as well is we do hear from nonprofit, we do hear from university that these are new requirements. These are things that you say 30 pages or something like that?
32 pages.
32 pages that, you know, is kind of lined up, don't line up, you know, that line up to what you have before. So what we have, and we want to let everybody knows that we do have in the FAQ grace period for, you know, to implement this provision. And it's basically 1 full year. So let me illustrate that. If your institution fiscal year is end on June 30 of 2015,
Yes.
the grace period is 7/1/15 to 6/30/16. So the first time that you have to implement the procurement standard is going to be for basically for your fiscal year 17.
That's great news, because we think it might take that long. But if I could just add, I'm sure we can also continue the discussion about some of these questions regarding procurement. I'll send you my list.
Oh.
Absolutely. And Kim, thank you for closing on that note, because I think we absolutely do want to continue this dialogue beyond today. And so thank you for kicking it off, and it will be an ongoing conversation going forward. Absolutely. So I think on that note, we'll say thank you to Kim. Yes. And our next topic for discussion will be for Tasha and Gil. And this is one of the key questions that we've got, primarily from Indian country, but from other folks as well, kind of about the order of precedence. Where does this guidance fit in, particularly when there are other statutes that might govern an entity's administration of their federal awards? And so, Tasha, let me turn it over to you to ask some questions about that.
Thanks, Victoria. So I haven't done it yet. I'm Tasha Rep. I'm a partner in the Tribal Services Group of Moss Adams. I'm here representing the Native American Finance Officers Association. I'm also their representative to the Governmental Accounting Standards Advisory Council. And I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation. So not only do I work in this area and have for the last 17 years, it's very personal to me how this affects Indian tribal governments. So the first question that I wanted to ask you, Gil, is that the new guidance provides tribes with an exemption to opt out of having their financial statements made publicly available on the Federal Audit Clearinghouse website, which is great. Indian tribes and NAFOA wrote a lot of comment letters about that, and we're really glad that that made it into the final guidance. But that guidance also includes a provision that says that they must make that information available for public inspection. Right. And I know that there's a lot of tribes that are concerned about making those statements available and whether or not that might conflict with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Is that something that you have looked at?
Yes, so basically nothing have changed there. We always have the policy, you know, from the very beginning of the Single Audit Act of 1984 and then revised in 1996, and also in our A133 that it's required in the law. Basically say that the auditee must make copy available for public inspection. So there's no change there. There's no change either that it kind of called out that in the very beginning, not at the end, beginning, it's a unless restricted by federal statute and regulation. So basically, if the Indian Self-Determination Act kind of preclude, kind of protect the tribe from displaying financial statement, that's just the policy is remain the same way.
Okay. So if a tribe or their tribe's attorney believes that the Indian Self-Determination Act does conflict, then that's the guidance we should be looking to.
Exactly. I mean, if in the past, you know, you have used, you know, people have asked for a tribe financial statement, and the tribe say, okay, well, we are protected. You are still protected, and we did not change. You know, the way it's a conflict of laws, then you know the law. The federal statute or regulation would trump what we have in the uniform guidance.
Well, I know there's a lot of attorneys already working on this. Another area that changed in the new guidance is that the definition of a tribe was separated from the definition of a state. And in that definition, it's a little bit narrower of a definition than is included in the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And there's still, I think, some confusion as to how tribally chartered or tribally created entities fit into that definition of a tribe. And also, there's a lot of tribal consortiums that are eligible for funding under the ISDEA, and wanted to know kind of how those types of entities fit within this new definition of a tribe.
So let's let me kind of half step back and then kind of answer, what we, the issues there. So there is a new requirement in the uniform guidance in section 512, report submission, that we're going to make the single audit. We receive about 45,000 single audit every year, to make that, starting with the next fiscal year, fiscal 15, to be publicly available. We're going to put that on our website, so we want everybody to be aware that, that's the momentum. Right now, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse only display the summary part of the audit, and people can get access to it. Starting next year, the section 512 going to require every single audit to be publicly available. However, we do have a section that basically say that the tribal can opt out.
Right.
Right. The tribal can opt out. That we won't. They don't. They still need to submit. They still do the.
Shucks.
They still need to do the single audit. They still need to submit the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and that's going to be shared just between the agency, but they not will be. They can opt. They can opt out. They don't have to opt out. They can opt out of having the public display. So I guess your question is delve into a little bit more in what is constituting that Indian tribe, in tribes. An entity, a nonprofit entity, for example, a hospital or a school, whether they can be included in that exemption. I think we did try to attempt to kind of define that a little bit in our FAQ, and saying that an entity that create as part of the tribal and accountable for in the tribal governance. I think that's the language that we say. And it's also included in the overall financial statement of that tribes. Then it can have that exemption as well. But what you're telling me now, though, is even that doesn't go far enough, and the Indian Self-Determination Act may have even a better definition on what are the entities that should include in the tribal entity, correct?
Yeah, the definition that I think a lot of tribes had hoped to see was related to a definition that's in Section 4 of the Indian Self-Determination Act, which is a little bit broader definition and really more clearly kind of defines these entities that a tribe creates, or these tribal consortiums definitely do fall under the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And we're hopeful that that was going to be a similar definition as it related to.
And if I could just jump in here, I would say, as in my memory, as the COFAR was kind of working through this issue in these definitions, the decision to pull the definition of Indian tribe out of the definition of the state wasn't because there was intended to be a major change to how Indian tribe is defined relative to how it ever had been defined before, but more because as we were bringing together 8 different circulars, A102, A110, all the cost principles, and the audit, those definitions did not always line up perfectly, and so we just had to make that change in order to ensure consistency across the guidance. So the intent was not to make a change to how Indian tribe is defined relative to how it was for purposes of the guidance. But that being said, we do hear your question that and the ISDEA Act provides a different definition than one that had been traditionally associated with the guidance. But I think the question that you're raising is a good one, and one that we've said that we would take back to the COFAR and look at and make sure that the intent was fully carried out and all the repercussions of it were what the COFAR intended. So I think we anticipate looking at that some more.
So I guess I also will look forward to more continued discussion.
Yeah,
yes.
I think this is exactly what Beth and Dave have been talking about, the continued dialogue.
Yes.
We put one set out. That doesn't mean that that this is not the final answer. We have better information. We'll take it. We will go back with our COFAR colleagues and discuss that and work it out.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think this is an excellent discussion, and I think now we will turn to some additional partners, and let me welcome Helena Sims from AGA, Steve Daniels from the Department of Labor, and Matt Hamuda from the state of Illinois. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And this is, I think, just to kind of turn the page from internal controls and some of the real accountability measures in the guidance, turning more now to some of the administrative flexibilities that were provided. And particularly, we know that there's a whole section up front around exceptions to the guidance, and that section in particular flags OMB Memorandum M1317, which provides opportunities for waivers based on innovative program designs that may be proposed by federal awarding agencies. Along with that language, there's also language in the section on what's fondly known as time and effort reporting, but officially known as 200.430 compensation for personal services, which again provides an opportunity for waivers with federal awarding agency approval for blended and braided funding. And so I wonder if states have any questions about this, and let me turn it over to Matt to see if this is something you guys have wondered about.
It absolutely is, and thank you very much, Victoria. And with the current state of affairs in Illinois, and I believe in many states, financial pressures are prompting us to be more creative or think about how we could better utilize our funding and use new innovative strategies to finance ultimate outcomes that all of our grants seek to accomplish. And with that being said, I understand that the new guidance offers some guidance and some guidelines as to where innovative financing can be used.
Yeah, Matt, it really does. Hello, I'm Steve Daniels. I'm the Director of the Division of Policy Review and Resolution at the Department of Labor. At the Department of Labor, we're a COFAR member and have a large formula mandatory grant program as well as an expansive discretionary grant program. And Matt, having actually worked on the uniform guidance, I've got some really great news for you. It's encouraging that the uniform guidance really does explicitly say, we'd like to encourage you to start thinking about a little bit more about performance over compliance, while still, of course, being accountable for the federal dollars. We're looking to achieve more efficiencies for combined outcomes. The uniform guidance really talks about innovation and really pushing the envelope forward. Of course, we got to be accountable for the federal dollar. And of course, there's got to be some outcomes at the very end and some performance metrics along the way. The great news, as Victoria's mentioned, is the guidance has this authority for blended funding. And that's in section 200.430. The bad news is if you want to do something today, you got to go somewhere else. And I think if you were to look at M13-17, you're going to find some relief and some authorities there. What's great about M13-17 is it really does encourage innovation, experimentation, and for us to test new approaches. So when we were thinking about trying to do some blended funding, looking at the uniform guidance, which isn't in effect yet, we thought, let's look at M13-17, which does provide some authorities. We want to talk about innovative, outcome-focused initiatives where we can blend funds in exchange for greater accountability for the outcomes on the other end. So if we want to reduce some of our compliance areas, or we wanted to try to not to be accountable for every single dollar that's expended against specific funding streams, then the guidance is saying you've got to have some very firm outcomes on the back end. And I think that's important also. That guidance, M13-17, also talks about having a very rigorous evaluation process as you complete your work, because what we're trying to do is to streamline, be innovative, and be outcome-focused as it relates to the federal dollar. At the Department of Labor, we had a recipient approach us and said, geez, we've got multiple funding streams, we've got multiple programs, federal programs, with a lot of common objectives and outcomes and goals. What can we do? We said, Matt, I said, yeah, I tried this braided funding thing. This is a great idea. You take these multiple funding streams and you braid them together and see what happens. So we worked that with our recipient. About 3 months later, they came back and said, we tried that blended funding thing. Didn't save us a penny. We were still accountable to each one of those individual funding streams against their specific performance outcomes. We didn't save a dime. In fact, it was labor intensive. What else can we do? Oh, and Steve, you had mentioned to us in the past this new concept that's in the uniform guidance called blended funding. So we worked with our recipient, and it took many meetings and discussions. And what we ended up doing is developing a concept paper, a proposal, which we in turn made to OMB, Victoria and Gill, in fact. Our blended funding proposal that we put together combines 3 federal agencies, 6 federal funding streams across 5 state agencies. A complex program, but we kept some of the basic things in mind as it relates to the uniform guidance in M13-17. And that was, how do we remain accountable to the federal dollar, but really focus on the outcomes, because that's what the new uniform guidance is saying. That's what M13-17 is saying, is give us the outcomes, remain accountable for the dollar, and tell me about how you're going to evaluate how your program went. So we developed our program, and it also involved a couple of waivers and deviations, which is okay under the uniform guidance. As we looked at our program, in order not to be so specifically accountable for every penny spent across that specific funding stream and those performance outcomes, we're going to need to have a couple of waivers. And that's under our common rule for the standards for financial management systems, as well as for financial reporting. We really focused on our metrics. We focused on our outcomes. What we in the state agreed to do, our recipient, in our proposal was to take a look at the funding that we've spent on a monthly basis. Where do we stand against the performance outcomes, but what are our milestones along the way, understanding we got a little bit of startup time involved. We think we've put together a pretty strong program. And under our blended proposal, all the funds get mixed in together, which makes accounting and apportioning the various dollars back out to the 6 funding streams extraordinarily important, as well as these specific performance metrics and outcomes for the Department of Labor, which I'm extremely interested in, and the other 2 federal agencies that are involved. So it's a complex program. We certainly at the Department of Labor don't have all the answers. We've got a little bit of experience as it relates to studying the guidance, drafting a concept paper, presenting it to OMB for their feedback and responses. And we've got some great feedback and responses. Actually, Matt, I wished I had known Helena prior to submitting the paper, because AGA has developed some tools and has some experience. With that, I'd like to ask Helena about some of her experience in the toolkit.
Well, I'll be happy to do that, Steve. And it was interesting. You and I really haven't talked much before this. And so many of the themes you talked about are themes that we have picked up in the work that we've done on this. I am Helena Sims. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the Association of Government Accountants. And the reason that I've been asked to be here today is we're working on a guide for braided and blended funding. I'd like to explain a little bit about, when I say we, who I mean. AGA, back a few years ago, created an intergovernmental partnership, and the reason that we did that is the Association of Government Accountants members are federal, state, and local. And we were interested in opening the doors for communication between the different levels of government. What we wanted to do was to figure out the administrative problems that exist between the levels of government, and see if we couldn't come up with practical guides to overcoming these programs. Now, in terms of why our intergovernmental partnership picked blended and braided funding, it goes back to an OMB initiative several years ago, or maybe it was only a couple of years ago, Victoria, when OMB was putting together a work group of people in the summer to work on the executive order on flexibility. And there were a number of issues that we talked about during that session. OMB brought people together from across the country on phone calls to talk about how can we increase flexibility? And of course, being with the Association of Government Accountants, one of the things we're interested in is not only how do you increase flexibility, but how do you maintain accountability? So that was a theme that summer in terms of flexibility. We were interested in accountability. And one of the recommendations that came out of that group was to pursue blended and braided funding. And one of the things that we did was we looked at some programs that the Environmental Protection Agency has in place, as well as the U.S. Department of Education. And I can talk a little bit about those, but I don't want to spend too much time. Also during that summer, there was a problem in Orlando with homeless children, and 60 Minutes focused a lot on that you had these children who were living in campers and trailers. And what occurred to some of us who were working with OMB on the flexibility initiative is, gee, you have homeless children. Look at all of the different funding sources, the different programs that could be used to help them. You have education, you have health care, you have housing, and other human service agencies. It's really important when you want to solve a problem in a holistic manner that you be able to combine funding from different sources. So we set out to find out what has already happened in this area, and based on that, what are things that we can see as common good practices, best practices? In terms of the Department of Education, they have a program called school-wide programs. And this is for schools that receive Title I, which is for low-income programs. What they want to do with a school-wide program, and this is legislatively authorized, is to address children that are in low-income schools to try to raise their performance up in a holistic manner. And the way they do that was a common theme that I heard you talk about and that we've heard others talk about. You get the stakeholders together. In this case, it's the parents and the students. Now, if you're talking elementary school, I'm not sure how you do that with students, but anyhow, and other stakeholders in the community that are working to improve the education of children. And you get them around a table and you develop a plan. First of all, you assess the needs. You get all the stakeholders together. You develop a plan like you've done for solving the problem. And then, and this is key, in the accountability area, what you do is the auditors audit against that plan. Rather than auditing a bunch of compliance requirements that stack on top of each other with each program that comes in, what you do is you decide up front what your goals are, how you're going to accomplish it, what the activities are that will demonstrate that you've reached your outcomes, and then you audit against those outcomes rather than all of those compliance requirements. So the common themes that we saw were you do a needs assessment, you convene the stakeholders, you develop a plan, and you audit against the plan. There's a similar program in EPA that is also statutorily authorized, and they have authorized, the secretary under legislative authority has said, okay, there are 17 programs under EPA that we can combine the funds for in a blended manner. It can deal with water. It can deal with hazardous substances. It can deal with air quality. It's given them great flexibility after tornadoes and floods and hurricanes to go in and shift money around between those different siloed programs to address emergency situations. So we were very encouraged by what we found, and we determined that there are mechanisms for assuring accountability when you increase flexibility.
Well, that's great. And you know, you mentioned a couple things about accountability, and it's great to hear the focus on outcomes and the ultimate goal of those grants. But how does this affect subrecipient monitoring?
Well, gee, that's a great question, and we certainly do know from Section 200.101 that the terms and conditions of award to the prime recipient are going to flow down to our subrecipient. I've got some more good news for you, too, as it relates to some flexibilities and some other things that you can do. There is something called the fixed amount award, and that's defined in Section 200.45. In 200.332, it does allow us to make fixed amount awards with our subrecipients. Now, that does require prior approval in order to do that, which means we're going to need to go back and get approval. And it also is limited to the small acquisition threshold. So there is a financial dollar cap on the amount we can do there. But there is some possibility and there is flexibility for actually executing some subawards with some of these new flexibilities. And I think you're going to really enjoy that.
That's great.
Now, as we've looked at the programs and as Helen's talked about it, there are going to be some potential issues, some things that you might want to think about as you develop your plan, Matt. And some of the key questions that we really struggled with in terms of our metrics and measuring oversight and monitoring is the funding piece. How do we fund as we blend? Are we going to dump all of that particular appropriation, that award amount, into our blended funding kettle? Or are we going to apportion those particular dollars based on those dollars apportionment against outcomes? Are they going to be based more upon the specific metrics and outcomes for those individual funding streams? And then importantly, too, and a question that OMB had asked us is, how are you going to prove it? How are you going to validate that? How are you going to measure that along the way? So those are questions that we've struggled with in terms of putting the appropriate answers to. The performance metrics also are keenly important to us. We know what our final outcome is, but as we proceed through the life of this blended funding program, how are we going to measure our progress along the way? For the Department of Labor in a particular training program, we're not going to have measurement of particular students who have graduated until that semester or that training program is concluded. That could be a semester, that could be a year away. So how do we measure that along the way? There could also be gainful employment metrics. I'm not going to be able to measure that for a year or 6 months after the student has graduated and completed their work. And those are inherent parts of our particular authorizing statutes. A critical piece, and Helen's kind of touched on this, is A133 audits. The auditor comes in, and now we've blended all of these funds into one big bucket, and we're now saying the end game is the most important thing because we're now going to be talking about performance over compliance. Well, what's the poor recipient supposed to have in their folder when the auditor comes in and says, I don't get this blended funding thing, you got this bucket full of money here from multiple agencies, what's going on? And I think Ellen's point in her toolkit about having this plan from which we're going to monitor, in addition to the waivers, the deviations we're going to establish ahead of the plan, those are going to be keenly important for our A133 auditors. So we need to have that taken care of. How do we oversee this program? How do we take a look along the way in relationship with the performance metrics that we've outlined? If the ultimate outcome is training and graduating students and gaining employment, and that's a ways down the road, how do I measure that along the way? I know that we want to have monthly checks in the program we've designed, but I don't have anything I can wrap my hands around and tell you, yes, we've graduated so many students or we've gainfully employed so many individuals. We kind of think that as we take a look at the whole process, that we're going to be evolving, and the first pilot program that we run isn't going to have all the answers. We're probably going to stub our toe a little bit. We're going to learn a little bit along the way. I think most importantly is the rigorous evaluation that's being required under M13-17 as well as the uniform guidance. And we've put in conjunction with our recipient a very rigorous third-party evaluation to tell us the hard facts of what went right, what went wrong, so that the next time we want to do a program, we're going to be able to hit the nail on the head or at least get a little bit closer so I'm not smacking my thumb every time I strike the hammer. We believe importantly at the Department of Labor and in our discussions with OMB that the process is going to be evolutionary in nature. We're not going to hit a home run the first time we swing the bat, but we believe over time as we work vigorously towards the goals and objectives of the uniform guidance, as well as what's outlined in M13-17, that, yeah, there are some tremendous efficiencies to be had. We got to dot some I's and cross the T's along the way, and we're going to make some mistakes along the way, but I think the overall intent is really fantastic. And this is great news, I think, for all of our recipients at state, as well as our recipients from discretionary awards.
Absolutely. It's very exciting.
Okay.
Well, I forgot to mention something that is probably pretty important, and that is the guide that we're working on will be available free online. It should be finished later this month. And for those of you who would like to get a copy of it, you can just Google Association of Government Accountants, and when you get to our website, you'll be able to find the report. So I just thought it was important to mention that as well. I don't know how we're doing on time, but
thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. I think this has been an excellent discussion. And I think we'll say thank you to Helena and Steve, and unless you have any other final parting thoughts to add, we'll move on to our next segment, and we'll welcome David Thompson from the National Council of Nonprofits, and also we'll welcome Kim Moreland back to the stage for a follow-up conversation. And this one is going to get to a topic that I know is a favorite for many of the folks in our community, indirect cost rates. And in particular, I want to just flag a couple new policies in the uniform guidance on the topic of indirect cost rates. The first is in section 200.414 that talks about indirect cost rates writ large. A couple of changes there. One is really intended to provide consistency for how federally negotiated indirect cost rates are provided. And those require all federal awarding agencies to use the federally negotiated indirect cost rate for their recipients unless there's an exception made by the head of the department or someone to whom they've delegated their authority. And even then, there are some conditions applied in terms of being transparent about those exceptions, including it in a notice of funding announcement, notifying OMB, and communicating that to all stakeholders up front. Another new policy in that section, which is really intended to reduce the administrative burden of the whole negotiation process, is an option that allows a non-federal entity that has a negotiated rate to extend that negotiated rate for up to 4 years with the approval of the cognizant agency for indirect costs. So right there you have another potential additional flexibility. And the third additional policy, and this is one that I think will be important to our folks today, is that we provide a de minimis indirect cost rate, which is 10% of modified total direct costs. And that's really intended for entities who have never had an indirect cost rate and for whom negotiating one is really an administrative burden that could even be a barrier to entry that might prevent them from even really applying for a federal award because they wouldn't be able to have an indirect cost rate and they might not be able to afford it if all their costs were therefore then not covered. Very important linkage to this set of policies is one when we talk about our subawards. And this is where I think our folks today will focus in. There's a requirement in section 200.313, requirements for pass-through entities, that actually requires pass-through entities to pass down an indirect cost rate to their subrecipients. If the subrecipient has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, that rate is required to be applied. If not, the pass-through entity may negotiate a rate or they may provide the 10% rate. So let me turn it over to my folks here today and see what questions you all may have about these new policies.
We have lots. Thank you very much, Victoria. That's the best summary of the third part I've heard out loud, so I very much appreciate it. I am David Thompson with the National Council of Nonprofits. I have the honor of working with a network of state associations of nonprofits that have focused on fixing government nonprofit contracting and grant-making processes across the country. Dave Mader opened the segment today talking about the goal is simplification. We're delighted to be on the side of simplification because typically we are fighting complexification, which is what we find across the country. So we're all on the right side now. Our process is to identify problems in the contracting and the grant-making system across the country, to work with our partners in government to identify solutions, and then work like crazy to implement those solutions. Victoria described the solution, the very important solution in the uniform guidance on payment of indirect costs. Let me put it in perspective because most folks don't understand this. Typical overhead costs for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations is in the range of 25 to 35%. If you ask most nonprofits, you'll discover that when they're contracting or providing services on behalf of governments, they typically are have their indirect costs reimbursement capped. And the vast majority of those, 75%, are capped at 10% or less, or paid 10% or less. And remember I said 25 to 35 is normal. So this solution is enormous. I'd like to ask Matt Hamou to talk about the experience in Illinois in terms of taking the OMB guidance and applying it to the work you do. But let me start with a quote that was in the frequently asked questions that have been referenced regularly. They came out the Friday before Labor Day. All of you on the COFAR website, just scroll down 2 notches and you'll find these frequently asked questions that were done very, very well. In describing the indirect cost provision and the requirement for pass-throughs to pay that, they explained why. The cost principles are designed to provide that federal awards pay their fair share of the costs. Matt, is that a novel concept?
That might be a trick question. If I may, and thank you for the question. And first, let me say, as the Assistant Secretary of Operations for DHS, which has over 4,000 contracts, over 2,000 vendors, we grant out well in excess of $4 billion. We were faced with to go back to what you originally said, simplification versus making things more complex. Back in 2010, Governor Quinn heard the calls of the state associations of nonprofits who said, please, make this possible for us to do business with you. You have 5 different ways of doing everything across every state agency. The governor at the time then created a bill which took 5 of the human service agencies and put them under a mandate to do exactly what you said. Make things add value, make them more simple. And as it relates to rates, it is not a secret that, especially in the world of human services, rates have sat stale for years. As times have changed, with the advent of the internet even, rates have stayed the same. And when we started implementing what is now referred to as the Management Improvement Initiative, which is also rolled into 2 other pieces of legislation in Illinois, by the way, adopting the federal rules for most grants, we found that what you said about everything being more complex was exactly true. There were 5 or more ways of submitting indirect cost proposals to each state agency. There were multiple standards on how to review and vet those requests. And we said, okay, enough is enough, we have to fix this. And what that meant from a state agency perspective was a change of culture, aggressive change management, looking at, a survey of asking each individual program within many, although fewer silos than in the past, still siloed areas of grant making and said, how are you looking at your rates? How are you asking your subrecipients for their indirect costs? And what we did was create one form for budget reporting with a separate table for cost allocation submissions. And by doing that, we made the process simple, to use your word. We have one way of submitting something to the state. And then we said, that's not enough, that's only step 1. Now how are we gonna review it with some level of consistency and efficiency with an eye on the things that are important to our subrecipients? Well, under the Grant Accountability Transparency Act, we centralized authority under the Governor's Office of Management and Budget to do just that. We published an RFP, or publishing an RFP now, for a master contract for cost allocation review. And for lack of a better word, building a docket based on how stale or fresh rates are, whether a rate ever existed, getting to the guidance that's offered, so that there could be a systematic approach without injecting more variability on the review, approval, and vetting of those indirect cost rates.
Very, very impressive. I think the key point you said quickly was that you actually incorporated the contents, the substance of the uniform guidance into Illinois law. Don't know if other states are open for that, but it's a fascinating concept. I really want to get to the lessons learned, because nonprofits that are listening or watching can learn a great deal from what you've been doing in Illinois. I know you've worked closely with our member Donors Forum, which is the state association in Illinois. And I know that other states and local governments can learn from that expel. So I want to get to those as quickly as we can. But first, can we clarify a couple of topics? You were talking about, you said stale rates. We call those out-of-date rates. How do we get to the point? Frequently, nonprofits experience a per diem, such as the price per day for a child at an overnight facility. Frequently, those rates were set 20 years ago. Frequently, those rates were set, maybe they included indirect costs, most likely they did not. How do you get, is that what you're talking about with your docket, when you get from an out-of-date rate to incorporate the indirect cost provisions and use the uniform guidance?
That's absolutely true. What has existed in the past are these rates that have existed in certain parts of government that folks were uncertain how to actually impact or affect or submit a new proposal for those indirect costs. And because of the variability both in the review and vetting, we centralized that review to make sure that the possibility was there for that rate to be adjusted. It's almost impossible to get a rate looked at unless there's a way of actually addressing it. And I said docket as more it's a prioritized list of review based on the stakeholder engagement. And you mentioned lessons learned, and this kind of dovetails into that. One of the most important lessons learned was, if we wanted to know where the most stale rates are, we engaged our stakeholders, our communities, our nonprofit associations, our provider associations, and our provider groups, and said, everyone come to the table. In fact, our table at the Management Improvement Initiative had over 15 to 20 provider representatives who came to opine as to, rates that may be well overdue in terms of review. Then we formalized a process on the submission of those indirect cost plans with a way of addressing them and vetting them for approval. It is not an easy process, and another lesson learned that dovetails well into your question is, we couldn't do this alone. We had to incorporate the expertise of an independent, objective person. Government agencies are always doing what they do. They have a lot of things going on. We're under-resourced. And is there anyone who is going to be the champion of change and corral 5 or more state agencies to start looking at their business practices? It was difficult until we've got an independent facilitator, someone who served as a catalyst not only for the discussions that needed to be had, for the collection of concerns from the provider or nonprofit community, and then bringing them to the table to actually advance it, bringing the right stakeholders from the right agencies to make sure that we found progress on each and every concern that was already out with our recipients, with our subrecipients. None of the issues that you mentioned or that plague nonprofits or our provider community are a secret, right? These are things that if we listen carefully, they resonate right through.
Before we get too far into the collaboration or the kumbaya part of the discussion, let me ask, I don't know if this is a hardball or a softball, but the uniform guidance talks about grants reform. A lot of talk about federal assistance. Those terms are foreign to most of us, and the nonprofits I'm mainly talking about are frontline, smaller organizations that are providing services in communities on behalf of governments. Can states and local governments avoid complying with the uniform guidance and the requirement of paying indirect costs by calling the written agreement between the nonprofit and the government a contract instead of a grant? Because we know some of our relationships are contracts, some are grants, and in New York, they actually have a grants contract, so it's very confusing. Can you conform Trump substance here, do you think?
Well, I don't know if that's a hardball or softball, and I'll tell you this. So the guidance that's issued through law, codified through rule, is exactly that. It is a binding authority that tells us what to do with an intent, with a specific intent. And can you meander your way in and out of intent? Well, when we heard from folks saying, oh, this money loses its traits, loses its federalism, it loses the principles that apply to it and the rules just because I put it in this bucket. For better or worse, we generally, I said, no. I mean, you can't just call federal money, federal grant money something else and then think all the rules fall off. That cuts both ways. Some folks say, well, and I know you're referencing the de minimis 10%. That's the hardball part of this. But there are assertions that say, well, those rules don't apply to me because I just called this a contract, so I don't have to report anymore, right? Well, no. We tell our, sorry, subrecipients, you just because the name is different doesn't mean that the intent of those rules, those binding rules, just fell off somehow.
I'd like to actually jump in here because I think, Matt, you said it perfectly that just because the name is different doesn't mean those rules fall off. And in the uniform guidance, there's a section that says almost exactly that. Which I think is probably worth flagging here, that provides guidance to pass-through entities on subaward versus contract determinations, and really makes that distinction that if that award is to carry out the mission of the federal award, then it's a subaward, and those terms and conditions flow down with it. If it's to acquire goods or services, and it is sometimes a gray area, there is a degree of judgment there, certainly, but then if it is to acquire goods and services really for the benefit of that pass-through entity, then it becomes a procurement. So
the relationships you have with, I think you said 2,000 or 3,000 nonprofits across Illinois, are those mostly, do you see those as in the grant category now, as well, Victoria just described?
They're clearly grant contracts. No, I'm just so those are in the grant arena. A majority of our contracts, we call them community service agreements. They're not contracts, not even. They are legally a contractual document, but they're community service agreements based on a grant relationship.
Terrific. Given the work you've done with the management improvement innovation or initiative and the preparation of the implementation of the uniform guidance, what are the lessons learned?
Well, and I mentioned some of these, but I want to go back.
And actually, let me interrupt. What lessons can both nonprofits and states and local governments learn from your experience? Because we're in this together. We want to make sure this is a collaborative effort.
And I'm glad you said collaborative, because I believe that is the strongest lesson learned. That this is a significant collaboration. It requires interplay between every stakeholder. From state agency to nonprofit community to other partners, and I said partners for a reason, because of the grant relationship. We ultimately are all partners and rely on everybody. Our responsibilities flow through, and getting the right stakeholders to the table with the facilitator to make sure we kept all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and making sure we considered impact in each different service area. The cookie cutter does not apply to the world of human services, for sure. And what we found was getting the folks with the expertise to the table, with an independent, objective person to keep everybody calm when we started talking about changing things, was really the strongest lesson learned. Other parts of this were getting the technology infrastructure, being able to share documents and data across 5 or 6 human service agencies really simplified the submission methodology and the review methodology, and took administrative burden away from this process. If we tried doing this without centralizing the submissions and the data we were all looking at, our provider community, our nonprofit organizations would have ran away saying, you're just killing us. We can't do this again in a different way. And I believe those were the strong lessons learned.
Mm-hmm.
I might just chime in since I have the opportunity. So I certainly admire what you're doing in Illinois, and just one state north in Wisconsin, we are just beginning to have some of these conversations, and I think that's the status in many university communities. And so we have a long, healthy, and continuing relationship with our friends in state government, and we need that to continue beyond any regulatory provision. And so how do you suggest we go about ensuring compliance with the provisions regarding F&A rates and recovery of indirect costs in a way that is collaborative rather than adversarial? And it goes back to the engagement with the stakeholders. When we are defining a new process that is value add without redundancy to ensure compliance, we want to make sure, especially at DHS in Illinois being the safety net agency, we have small, mid-sized providers, nonprofits who need to be at the table or represented at the table, so we ensure that when we are seeking compliance, we're not adversely impacting the ultimate goal of even this guidance, which is that outcome, which is, what this grant money was meant for. So we will not take a step that hurts, government, not everyone will agree, but we try not to take steps that will hurt outcomes or the administration of these grants. And the best way to ensure that is to bring folks who are in each respective service area to the table and ask them what this impact will have and what is the best way of achieving compliance. If I need to collect data or documents or outcomes from you, which Illinois also has an ambitious effort in doing, we want to make sure we don't do anything to force them to take a couple steps back in their productivity and their delivery of service. Thank you.
You use the phrase culture shift. This is requiring a culture shift that you in Illinois have been pursuing a culture shift for a number of years. We recognize that nonprofits in working collaboratively with government is going to require some trust. So our state associations are working closely to promote relationships and trust. The uniform guidance challenges something that should not be conventional wisdom, but frequently is, and that is just the concept of imposing caps on indirect costs. Some people are of the view that that's some way of ensuring efficiency. If you cap indirect costs, more money goes to programs, theoretically. The nonprofit perspective is this is a guaranteed way to deny or frustrate efficiencies and greater impact. Do you have views? Is there a formal view or a personal view that you could share?
And I mean, this is a personal view, and it's currently the path we're taking in Illinois. Initially when we started working on this 5 years ago, and I wasn't as familiar with the world of human services or grants, I said, capping this would be a good idea. And
capping indirect costs,
and that was a bad idea. 5 years later, I say, and through stakeholder engagement, I was taught why that was such a bad idea. Because it ignores the ultimate goal of that grant, which is the outcome. If you truly want to find innovative ways and efficient ways of getting to an outcome, you can't arbitrarily cap something. It will prevent exactly that, creative and innovation. Furthermore, as long as costs, and every grant is different, every scope is different, indirect or costs, overhead, can be different for good reason, and as long as they are allowable and they can be provided, vetted, and reviewed. An arbitrary cap seeks to really hurt the ultimate goal of getting to that outcome, whatever it may be, because it puts this false parameter and false restriction on the ability to administer it.
There's some challenges in enforcing the indirect cost rate provision or many of the proposals here. The earlier panel talked about compliance, talked about the audits and internal controls and things like that. And the ultimate question is for what purpose or who will be held accountable? Will anyone be held accountable? We know that if a local government ignores the provisions, at some point there will be a determination from an inspector general or someone saying you've ignored, these were provisions that should have been applied. I don't know, would imagine there would be back pay or some other payment requirements and things like that. That's not in anybody's interest. What can nonprofits do now to get it right so that it makes it easier for states to implement? What can states do so that we're not in litigation after the fact, that we're getting everyone together to to implement systems that work, implement trainings that work so that program officers and nonprofit leaders are all learning the same rules at the same time? What can we do together?
Well, I mean, together we can learn from the success and the lessons learned from other states who have reached the outcomes, the ideal outcomes, and mirror. And in this, I heard the word evolve earlier. I believe the world of grant administration is evolving. It's becoming stronger. It's becoming more fit for the ultimate goal rather than just parameters that fit around it to try to control it. And that being said, states have to, and states have to engage their stakeholders, and some states are engaged by their stakeholders with no way to ignore the calls of their members, and instead say you have to do this correctly. Now, how are states going to follow the law and the rules that are codified? Can they ignore them? I would say talk to their lawyers. You cannot ignore things that are in law or codified. You have to use either the valid exception process that exists in the guidelines, or implement them as they are written, or fear from your auditors.
And I think on that note, I'll just go ahead and jump in and say thank you. I think, Matt, of course you make an excellent point, and David, these things are in the guidance, and we do have tools like audits to understand how folks are implementing the guidance and to monitor that implementation. But I think your underlying theme, which is the one I really want to highlight, is that it's actually much more productive if we engage and we have this conversation far before it gets to that point. And I think we heard that from our auditors earlier today when we were talking about internal controls as well. You can even engage them early if there are questions. And I think that you guys have actually provided a shining example of that collaboration. And we hope that that can be a lesson learned for everyone watching here today. This is just the beginning of the conversation. And I think on that note, I'd like to just say thank you to our panelists and turn it over to our controller, David Mader, for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Victoria. And on behalf of all of us at OMB, thank you for, first of all, for the panelists for taking the time for what I found it incredibly fascinating and educational for me as sort of the newbie into this space. And I certainly think that the audience, the large audience that participated in today, really got a lot out of the conversation. And I think it reinforced what Beth and I both said in our opening remarks, and I think a lot of the panelists talked about, that we're all in this together. We all share the same objective and the outcome. We may work for different organizations, but by working together and collaboratively, we can actually achieve what we all want to achieve. So thank you and good luck.